I'm a scientist by training, an astronomer in particular, one who made a transition into science education in order to be more freely developmental along many lines.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I have a kind of two-pronged question. One is these lines of development.
Yeah.
It seems to me that spiritual development really depends on a basis of physical, intellectual, emotional development, that they're not separate things, that a spiritual evolution really requires that kind of basis.
Yeah.
In particular, though, I'm interested in the role of science education outside of science's normal box of consideration. For example, it can play a role in helping with the facilitation from a pre-rational to a trans-rational. For example, it can support the understanding of a more world-centric view if you get into the systems science or the astronomical perspective, which I'm particularly interested in. The nature of inquiry, the nature of complexity, your delightful metaphors. Oh, these stages are more like waves of probability, or galaxies in the palm of your hand. So I'm curious what you would say about the role of greater science literacy, even understanding developmental hierarchies themselves. A science-minded person in the orange meme would not deny that. And yet the mean green meme, the role in trying to help with that issue of the leap to second tier. So I feel like there's a real role here for science and science education that maybe is a bit untapped, and I'm curious.
Oh, I agree entirely. And let me very briefly address that by saying that when we talk about spiritual, there are so many different meanings that we have to be a little bit careful about what we're talking about. And the way you're talking about spiritual is a very, very valid way of talking about it, and an extremely important dimension of what I believe spiritual is. But let me very briefly give you sort of three broad ways to think about spiritual or spirituality, what it might mean, because I think all three of these are important. And then see if you agree and see how it relates to something that we call science education. One is well, let's put it this way, and I just named them, and then we can talk about them briefly. Sometimes when people use the term spiritual, what they really mean, whether they put it this way or not, is that if you take any developmental line, like affective development or cognitive development or interpersonal development, and you look at what they mean the upper levels of any of those lines are called spiritual. So if you take the affective, the emotional line, lower emotions are greed, anger, hatred, etc. Middle emotions are conformity, loyalty, duty, obligations. And then higher levels of that tend to start to be universal love, even bliss, blissananda. And if you ask people, which of those do you think are spiritual? Most will say the top ones. And the same with the cognitive line in general. If you take the lower things about concrete rules or tied to very sort of rigid categories, and then you get into formal operational cognition or logic, and then you get into the trans-rational levels, and you ask people which ones are spiritual, they say the upper ones. So that's one definition, and it's actually sort of implied in the meaning of transpersonal psychology. It's talking about the trans part of these things. So that's one meaning. It's very, very, I think it's very important. Another meaning is that spiritual development can be its own line. And James Fowler took this approach. And so on that aspect or dimension of spirituality, which I think also is very real, is that going all the way back to the earliest ages, there's a spiritual capacity in human beings. And this capacity can develop like any of the others. And it depends on how you define it. I like the definition Paul Tillich gave spirit and spiritual impulse, which is a concern, and he called it ultimate concern. So that spiritual component in you is, what are you ultimately concerned with? So in a sense, you can actually go back and say, what's an infant ultimately concerned with? And in the first 3 months of life, it's where's the breast? It's food. Now that returns in some male adolescents, but we'll get back to that. And so you can actually, and then what becomes the real concern of the child? And it's, when some early adolescents are saying, well, if I don't go to the prom, I'll die. And that's their ultimate concern. It seems a little bit, you know, silly, but you can remember it, what that's like. And so that's your religion in that sense. People say logic is Spock's religion. Everybody knows what that means. It's your ultimate concern. So you can actually, and James Fowler actually traced some of these out. And then in the higher dimensions of that as well, spirit goes into an ultimate concern with, all of a sudden, I'm concerned with the fate of all humanity. All of a sudden, I'm concerned with the fate of the planet. All of a sudden, I'm concerned with all sentient beings. And that moves you as much as, if I don't go to the prom, I'll die. And now all of a sudden, there's a motivation, if I can't do something for all sentient beings, I will die. So that's another way to look at it. And we'll come back to science. Now, there's a third, and there are a couple others, but I'll just mention these three, and we can come back to some of the others if it comes up. But a third, and it's very common, is people will say something is spiritual if they had like a really strong peak experience. And you can have peak experiences at any stage of development. That's very important to understand. Using spiral dynamics, red, blue, orange, green, yellow, you can have a powerful peak experience or a spiritual experience now at purple. You can have it at red. You can have it at blue. So you don't have to, in the first two definitions of spiritual, you have to be at the top of the rung to have a spiritual experience. Now, a lot of people know, well, women, that's not always the case. Because I've had very powerful spiritual experiences, and I know I'm a little lower on the food chain. So those three now, and we can look at those. Now, what's happened, unfortunately, is not that spiritual experiences have been tapped into on a widespread scale, particularly in the alternative universities and colleges. It's that the other two have been denied or even ridiculed because they're stage conceptions. And as you say, if you actually mention hierarchy, because hierarchy is completely misunderstood, the actual meaning of it is categorically misunderstood. I've never seen a writer on the new paradigm get the definition right. That's an embarrassing way to begin an approach to the most transformational new paradigm in the history of the universe, is to get the definitions wrong. So they tossed those two out. So it's not regrettable that there's a great deal of emphasis given on experiential immediacy and feeling and a capacity to set aside the intellect, so to speak, and just get immersed in states. That's fantastic. But when you set aside these other two, it's a catastrophe. And it actually tends to be a little bit regressive in ways we can talk about. So if we go back and look at the other two, and let's use Aurobindo's developmental line of cognition. And he starts with basically sensory-motor perception, and then representational thinking, and then formal operational thinking, and then the higher mind would be about vision logic. And then above that are at least four stages of cognitive development, which he called the illumined mind, the intuitive mind, the overmind, and the supermind. Now, this is a developmental sequence. He's not talking about states now. He agrees those exist. This is a developmental sequence. You can't skip stages in a developmental sequence. So if science, for example, is the exercise of the formal operational and even vision logic, systems theory uses vision logic in terms of science. If the study of science specializes even in those middle realms of cognition, it's a crucial bridge from the lower to the higher. And if you leave the scientific study out and even denigrate it, you're going to really cripple the bridge. If nothing else, you're going to cripple the bridge between the lower and the higher.
I wonder about its role in the mean green meme.
The role of the mean green meme is to run for cover. The mean green meme is just simply throwing it out.
Yeah.
And what they've done is used a misunderstanding of Derrida and Foucault. Both Derrida and Foucault have recanted from the way American deconstructionists and extreme postmodernists use the terms. And technically, for those of you who follow it, the whole point of deconstruction is that there is no transcendental signifier. And both Derrida and Foucault have made it very clear they don't believe that. And Foucault himself openly embraced what the Kantian version of rationality, which puts him in the camp of Habermas. And Derrida, in a book called Positions, admitted that there was a transcendental signifier, or you couldn't even translate languages. So for the... So just to show you how exciting this can get, for those of you who thought that it's going to be dull, 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 we have. So the mean green meme, based on a misunderstanding of the authorities they themselves are quoting, came up with a conception of knowledge, that all knowledge is socially constructed. And therefore, science, as a social construction, not based in any objective anchoring, is no more real or believable than poetry or art or et cetera.
I understand.
And so it's a way for them to basically get rid of any constraints on their beliefs.
And that's not science literate, and therefore science literacy becomes a barrier to the evolution of consciousness. Or lack of literacy in science.
Correct. Absolutely. No, if you get the thing that jams green and turns it into boomeritis green and a mean green meme, is that if it can't come to terms with a healthy version of orange,
yes, it's
going to jam. And so what we have with a lot of, I mean, it's used to in psychotherapy, if you're working with somebody who has some really, primitive urges, subpersonalities, difficulties, it's common to say, well, they have a red subpersonality. And that's often true. I mean, you can be, orange or green or yellow and have a split off red subpersonality. A lot of people at green have split off orange subpersonalities.
Yes.
In other words, there's little subpersonality in their psyche that is actually a frustrated CEO of Enron. And because they can't come to terms with that drive, they split it off and dissociate it. And we have to deal with this in the sustainability people, because so much of the environmental movement, which has so many important things, has a really dissociative relation to orange. And so in addition to the objectively unpleasant things that some orange businesses with red ethics do, some environmentalists project their own shadow elements onto them. And then it makes it impossible to do sane environmental work.